Well, this has been a long time coming. It may look like and provide a verdict for each, placing them in one of 6 tiers. 2 things about this tiering system. First, only a single category may be placed in each tier. Even if a category is only marginally more combat optimal than another one, the more optimal category will be placed a tier above. 2. While this may spoil some of the results for those that have not seen my previous videos on the topic, I'll also conglomerate these 6 tiers into 3 bigger groups, which I will term the Kings of Combat tier, the Wild Card or Joker tier, and the Jack of All tier. I'm going for a playing card gimmick. It's not that important, but since I made a rule for myself not to put 2 together, then they are to the categories outside the grouping. I hope that makes sense. To clarify immediately, when I say combat, I mean something akin to 2 characters of a more or less equivalent skill level in an immediate or at least nations, i.e. where an opponent doesn't even know they're engaged in combat, or lengthy prep times. All other factors, such as exact distance, i.e. melee, can vary. With that established, a few things before we get into it. First, please note that while I will reference individual users to make more generalized capacity to be attuned for combat, every category has its geniuses that excel in combat, each with their own personal strengths and weaknesses. Certain characters will also be natural counters to others, but I'm not discussing individual matchups either. Second, while obvious, I feel like I have to say it. This is the course of this channel. Based on the info we get, either via new chapters or supplemental material provided personally by Togashi himself. Please think of this video more as a springboard for a wider discussion. But turn on your caps lock, click on add a comment, getting into it. Alright, let's begin with the least obvious category first. Specialization. I'll be very blunt, I am of the belief that it does not possess a standard proficiency distribution, or its proficiency distribution simply cannot be applied and expanded upon. I made a whole video as something of a companion to this one, wherein I went over this notion in much greater detail. Please feel free to check it out, either before or after watching this one for additional context. Honestly, when I first considered this topic a few months back, I seriously thought about excluding it entirely due to how ambiguous it is. But for the sake of completeness, I'll do my best to include it after all. Either categories, it's not defined by an inherent NAN mechanic. Enhancement's innate and most basic mechanic is the bolstering of one's physical traits, such as specialization is defined by the fact that it doesn't have a defining mechanic. This, along with the categories, which does make sense, they are established in world as being quite rare, makes the prospect of generalizing their combat prowess quite difficult. With that said, a specialist truly specializing in combat with an entirely combat-oriented Hatsu would be an absolute beast. I say this because a specialist who full-on specializes in combat would always be the more combat-attuned and themselves, being almost predetermined in a lot, if not all, specialists. This means that they may be. Furthermore, since the Hatsu in question would be specialization-based, it wouldn't be limited by any mechanic inherent to the category, since specialization doesn't have any, and would therefore be entirely unpredictable. For example, their Hatsu may appear to be transmutation-based attack. Specialists are unsurprisingly at the as in knowing someone is a specialist tells you basically nothing about the potential nature of their Hatsu. 40% proficiency in enhancement, as you may expect them to, making them quite durable even in a potential melee brawl. As I said, any other NAN user of the good news for everyone else is that specialists basically never have explicitly combat-focused abilities. Neon and Pakunoda need no elaboration. Now, while both being combat-attuned, Chrollo especially, borrows and Chrollo steals, they need not be. While we do not know all the conditions of 4th Prince Terror Sandwich's Foresight ability, since it requires of him to maintain a state of however, I would say it is absolutely combat-attunable, depending on all of its, thus far unknown, conditions and limitations. Stealth. We also have Kurapika, who is a special kind of specialist, but he's primarily a conjurer, so I won't be counting him. As you can see, very few specialists exhibit explicitly combat-focused abilities meant to damage, directly incapacitate, or otherwise neutralize an opponent. Instead, tremendous destructive power, but also an innate heavy-duty defense, as well as unparalleled healing and recuperation. while simply with truly supernatural feats of strength and durability, such as pushing dozens of tons of weight, or tanking gunshots, or even bazooka blasts. This makes them the foundational kings of melee brawls, since even a single head-on punch from an enhancer can prove crippling or even deadly, while vice versa is almost no-range options, should they decide to spec into it. Finally, it is also the only category that isn't. This inherent capacity to dole out damage, paired with their unrivaled defense, is the reason why they are in general considered to be the most balanced category in terms of attack and defense. Considering all this, you'd be entirely justified in thinking that enhancement should comfortably occupy that S-tier spot. But there are two big reasons why I don't share that view. 1. Enhancement is insanely simple. So simple that a lot of combat-oriented enhancement-based Hatsu come down to turning Ko, i.e. the principle of concentrating aura in one particular body part, into a Hatsu by either just giving it a badass name like Uvogin's Big Bang Impact, or adding a gimmick to it like Shu, i.e. the principle of enveloping objects in one's aura in order to enhance their properties into a Hatsu instead, such as Goto and Nobunaga. These two advance the property of emission to transfer abstract notions like thoughts or damage that are lower, due to him only having a mere 40% proficiency in emission. However, we've yet to see a combat-attuned enhancement-based ability that we can say is truly an advanced application of enhancement. Even the greatest enhancer we've seen, Isaac Netero himself, seems to presumably only use enhancement to boost the speed, to even have an enhancement-based Hatsu Nidai per combat-oriented enhancement-based Hatsu that doesn't come down to punching, slashing, or flicking harder. The closest we've come to what I'd deem a truly advanced application of enhancement may be the capacity for enhancers to enhance their mastery of a particular skill, since Komugi's ever-increasing aptitude for Gungi was confirmed to actually be an enhancement-based Hatsu. It's therefore technically possible that someone like Nobunaga may be able to literally increase his swordsmanship mastery, though how viable that even is has yet to be established. 2. Because it is so simple, it is also very predictable. As soon as you realize someone is an enhancer, you'd know exactly what to expect and what to be on the lookout for. Yeah, you're almost certainly not winning a straight-up brawl, but that's fine. There's no reason to engage the enhancer on their own terms. If you're a combat-oriented member of any other category, you almost certainly have an actual well-developed Hatsu that isn't just a differently colored aura-empowered punch. If specialists are the least predictable among the 6 categories, enhancers are by far the most predictable. I say you'd still need to be careful though, since an enhancer could easily surprise you by blasting your butt from the other side of the room if his Hatsu was bolstered by emission, for example. One of the 2 emission lean enhancers, Goto, is proof of this. Ikalgo's emission lean too, but he's one big nonsensical mess of categorization, so let's not get into that. In any case, based on what we've seen thus far from the various enhancement users throughout the story, 8 out of 10 times you're good in that regard. While they don't have to, enhancers prefer to keep things simple. Just don't get punched. Easy, right? It's not. An enhancer could easily blitz you before you have the chance to do anything. However, the aforementioned Hatsu simplicity and consequent predictability is why enhancement will be ranked at B tier, the lowest among the 3 kings of combat. Let's now tackle the top 2 categories, since I actually found it easier to decide that than the bottom 2. Let's start with transmutation. In a more general sense, transmutation has the same benefit of having 2 adjacent categories in which it has an 80% proficiency in, those being a fantastic neighbor in the form of enhancement and a decent neighbor in the form of conjuration. The reason I say enhancement fantastic and conjuration only decent is because we are discussing combat specifically. While I'm sure there are quite a number of ways for a transmuter to incorporate conjuration as a part of their combat-oriented Hatsu, thus far there's been only a single unconfirmed example of this we've seen, and that's Phaeton conjuring his armor Painpacker to shield himself from the heat of rising sun. I say unconfirmed because while he was stated to be a transmuter in a databook, that has not been officially confirmed by Togashi, who has already contradicted them in the past, e.g. with Zen and Silva both being confirmed by him to be emitters and not transmuters, as one databook previously claimed. While unconfirmed, it would make sense, since Rising Sun entails him transmuting his aura into heat based on the level of damage he is sustained. Painpacker should be a reminder that transmuters are not immune to the properties their aura mimics, with Killua and his lightning being a note notable exception, due to his borderline magical assassination training. As such, I can see quite a number of transmuters tapping into Conjuration in order to shield themselves against their own transmutation-based Hatsu. For example, if Genthr wasn't a smooth-brained cretin, he would have conjured gloves to shield himself from the transmutation-based little flower explosions, instead of just coating his hands in copious amounts of aura. Sure, he'd lose the surprise factor, but he already has countdown for that, and now he'd be able to actually damage Nen users that he doesn't already entirely outclass. Now, we do have an actual confirmed Conjuration midpoint transmuter in the form of Hanzo, but it's questionable whether his combat-oriented abilities actually utilize Conjuration in any way. Thus far, we've only seen Hanzo's skill 4, which is an infiltration or assassination ability type and not a combat-oriented one, since he literally needs to enter a sleep-like state in order to activate it. It makes sense, therefore, that combat-focused transmuters will either gravitate to enhancement, like Machi and Killua, or just stay pure transmuters, like Hisoka, Biscuit, and Yuppie. Another benefit of transmutation is in the variety and therefore unpredictability of the Hatsu it offers. As in, knowing or realizing your opponent is a transmuter won't go a long way in allowing you to predict their Hatsu. Transmutation entails changing the quality of a user's aura to mimic solidity, electricity, heat, threads, cuteness, and can even mix and match attributes, such as Hisoka's Bungee Gum having the properties of both cope and seethe. The sheer variety of potential abilities make transmuters only fall behind specialists and one other category with regards to their potential ability repertoire. Finally, while transmuters do like to keep things rather simple, transmuting their aura into heat, explosions, threads, rubber and gum, and so on, I have no doubt of transmutation's capacity to create complex, high-level, combat-attuned abilities. Unlike with enhancement, we at least have a single precedent of this, in the form of Killua's Godspeed, which I will go on record as asserting to be the most complex transmutation-based combat-attuned Hatsu we've seen in the series thus far. Transmutation really offers a lot, both via its positioning and nature, with minimal drawbacks, the biggest of which is that the users themselves generally aren't immune to the damaging effects or substances they mimic, which can necessitate tapping into emission to create sufficient distance, or conjuration in order to create powerful enough defenses to weather the onslaught of their own abilities. However, this is not characteristic of the category as a whole, since not all of its users transmute their aura into inherently damaging substances, like Machi and Hisoka. This, while the issue of simplicity and predictability that plagues enhancement does so on a category-wide level. Pretty damn good, isn't it? Transmutation is a balanced category, offering a lot of benefits and minimal drawbacks. It should absolutely be ranked at the very tippy-top, shouldn't it? That's precisely what I thought for the longest time as well. However, in the last 20 or so chapters, a category I had previously already believed to be fantastic for combat has received a substantial glow-up. I am of course referring to none other than Manipulation. Manipulation is the definitively best combat-attuned Nen category. Why? Dude, you can control people, of course it's manipulation. Get your head out of your emission, it's emission, I'm kidding. Emission is, in my humble opinion, the best combat attunable Nen category, as of chapter 400. Just like transmutation, it not only has a fantastic neighbor in enhancement, but also a great one in manipulation. While most combat attuned emitters will of course be pure emitters, such as Zeno, Silva, Razor, and Meruem, others like Franklin and Leorio will lean more towards enhancement. However, it's also really easy to see how an emitter could tap into manipulation to his great benefit. Manipulating emitted Nen projectiles, controlling emitted Nen beasts, controlling conjured or mundane objects infused with aura from afar, and so on. In general, it's more intuitive to imagine what an emitter tapping into manipulation than a transmuter tapping into conjuration could potentially gain by doing so. I'd also argue that controlling your own aura is significantly easier than learning to conjure a whole suit of armor. The skill floor of conjuration is much higher than with manipulation in my opinion, i.e. just learning to conjure up an object without even adding any supernatural effects to it can be quite the ordeal and would require a lot of time, focus, and overall Nen memory, as termed by Hisoka. That's just my personal opinion though, this was never stated anywhere. The biggest reason I had believed transmutation to be superior to emission was its aforementioned repertoire of potential abilities. For the longest time, it felt like emission was limited limited to firing off Nen projectiles, emitting Nen beasts, or teleporting, making it predictable in a similar vein to enhancement. However, advanced application of emission has shown itself to be capable of phasing through matter, transferring abstract notions such as thoughts and damage, and potentially even Hatsu acquisition. While it is true that the guy who attempted the Hatsu acquisitioning in question was a manipulator, I quite frankly cannot see the acquisitioning of another's Hatsu being done via pure manipulation, and strongly suspect his Hatsu was made possible by tapping into his adjacent category of emission, in which he'd have an 80% proficiency. This would mean that with a sophisticated mastery of the category and appropriate conditions, an emitter could create an ability acquisitioning Hatsu akin to Krollos or Leals. While I would like to say we have a precedent in the form of Meruem acquiring the abilities of Poof and Yuppie, it's quite unclear whether that was possible because of his status as a pure emitter, his chimera anti-biology, or most likely, a combination of the two. In any case, these latest developments in emission make it into a far more complex and unpredictable category than it was once considered to be. By me. Specifically, I believe that it is as of now in 4th place, just behind transmutation. The final two things which seal the deal for me are that 1. Emission is the category that specializes, no pun intended, at long-range combat, the advantage of which cannot be understated. However, despite this, its users are more than capable of waging combat in melee thanks to their 80% proficiency in enhancement, with those emitters like Silva, Zeno, and Lynch having no qualms with fighting their opponents in melee range, some with more success than others. And 2 of the most powerful abilities we've seen in terms of pure destructive power have been Netero's Zero Hand and Meruem's Rage Blast. I know you might say I'm basically cheating by using the Chimera Ant King and the chairman of the freaking Hunter Association as examples, but don't get me wrong, my point isn't that emission necessarily has more destructive power than enhancement or transmutation. My point is simply to emphasize the potential destructive power of emission on its own merits. In conclusion, on emission, neither it nor transmutation have any particular faults or weaknesses inherent to them, with both having very favorable placements within the diagram and very decent potential ability repertoires. While either could take that top spot, I personally feel that emission has the slight edge owing to A. It being the category you need to tap into if you want to do almost anything at range, the advantage of which cannot be understated, and B. I do feel like emission has the edge in its diagram placement, since I think there are more things emitters can do with manipulation to potentially make their abilities more effective when compared to what a transmuter tapping into conjuration could, since I feel like they'd more often than not do so more as a condition to make their abilities viable in the first place, rather than simply strengthening them. With that established, let's now move on to the bottom 2 spots, which are occupied by none other than conjuration and manipulation. As you may or may not know, I recently made a whole video on the topic, but did not provide a I'm fairly confident I have an answer. So, why are conjuration and manipulation placed this low in the first place? Well, before we get to any specifics regarding each category proper, we need to talk about their positioning, which is just the worst. They not only have a 60% proficiency in enhancement, which is not ideal, Uvogin shattered Kurapika's arm with a single punch, while Pika was presumably getting a boost to his defenses via Emperor time, the efficiency in each other. As such, conjuration and manipulation have only a single adjacent category in which they have an 80% proficiency. Now, with regards to their respective neighbors, I definitely believe that while transmutation is a solid neighbor to have, emission to trigger their Hatsu at range, since, as I've hopefully established throughout this video ad nauseam, isn't a combat-attuned conjurer or manipulator, is far less straightforward themselves for combat. By that I mean that while their Hatsu can absolutely be used in combat, and used to great effect, things they can do well. Hence why I'm referring to this duo as jacks of all, whose abilities were actually intended to be combat-attuned, from those whose abilities can simply be used, such as Shizuku's Blinky really seems to be specialized for vacuuming, which it admittedly does pretty damn well. Sure, bludgeon people to death, mostly. Sure, it can be done, but feasible. Taking this distinction into account, the combat functional conjurers include Genthru, Heinrich, Kite, Knuckle, Kurapika, Bonolenov, Sayu, presumably, and so on. As far as combat functional manipulators are concerned, we've got Boki lineups. There's only a few I'd set apart as true combat heavy hitters. The two categories are more or less equal in the number of users with combat capable and combat specialized Hatsu. Now let's discuss the internal mechanics, strengths and weaknesses inherent to objects, but also endow them with supernatural properties. This often doesn't entail simply tapping into the other categories, such as kite tapping into enhancement and/or emission for silent waltz, but also exhibits entirely supernatural properties that cannot really be attributed to any other category proper, such as making their conjured Nen beasts invincible, or conjuring a word salad, I know. Essentially, since Kurapika conceptualizes chains as something capable of restraining something, specifically people that are evildoers, he created a Hatsu to, as he aptly puts it, chain evil down to hell. In order to better perform said function, he imbues it with a superintendent functionality of restraining very specific evildoers. As long as a supernatural effect has the intuitive capacity to bolster the functionality of a particular conjured object, Nen beast or space, a sufficient is what makes it so unpredictable and consequently dangerous on a category-wide level. Sure, after you see the conjurer has conjured chains, you could make an educated guess as to the nature of their abilities. But before that, should you keep your distance, engage as soon as possible? Is their conjured object already somewhere in proximity? Do they conjure objects, spaces, or Nen beasts? Are you actually looking at a conjured doppelganger of the user? The possibilities are nearly endless. Furthermore, while they can create rather complex conditions for their abilities to trigger, they don't necessarily have to. While this sort of ability is extraordinarily rare in case of conjurers, Owl's Fun Cloth essentially comes down to a one-hit win ability, having the ability to shrink and store away whatever it envelops. We unfortunately do not know the exact limitations and conditions of the cloth, but it seems pretty apparent that a simple trigger to incapacitate on a hit conjuration ability can work, which is all the precedent we need. These kinds of abilities are simply much more optimal for battle, since any Hatsu overly reliant on conditions, which many conjuration Hatsu are, can be dead in the water depending on the opponent, their Hatsu, pre-battle knowledge and prep time, battlefield and environmental factors, and so on. Think Inamura that can only be used on rainy days, or indoor fish which can only be conjured in a closed-off space. To say they're inconvenient would be an understatement. Now, while it is true that opting for trigger on hit abilities sounds optimal for a combat-oriented conjurer, it would also almost necessarily make what a conjurer is trying to do quite obvious. E.g., it's immediately clear that Kurapika wants to hit you or capture you with his chains. Now, while something like the potential effects of a conjured cloak would be more ambiguous, a semi-competent Nen combatant would know one very important thing for certain. If that cloak is to be used on him, i.e. the opponent, it needs to be used at either melee or very short range. Conjurers simply do not have the capacity to initiate their abilities at range, since the category that primarily allows for that, i.e. emission, is the category they have a measly 40% proficiency in. Think about it, every conjurer who needs a trigger for his ability to activate always needs to touch or hit his opponent or the object in question. Knuckle, Genthru, Heinrich, Kortopi, Owl, etc. all illustrate this point. That's a big problem, because those opponents who are emitters or manipulators with medium to long range abilities would be able to have a definite advantage when fighting a conjurer with a melee or short range Hatsu, while enhancers or transmuters who prefer fighting at melee or short range, while easier opponents to fight, could still blitz, overpower, or simply take by surprise a conjurer in melee or short range, since unlike him, they do not have to advertise their Hatsu beforehand by having it out in the open for all to see. Let's finally move on to manipulators. As a baseline, manipulation's core mechanic entails the control of animate entities, as in animals or people, or inanimate ones, as in mundane objects or Nen constructs. Their capacity to take control of an opponent solely based on a single trigger, like a needle to the body, is where manipulators draw their infamy from, and is something every half-decent Nen user would be on the lookout for unless he knows or until he realizes his opponent isn't a manipulator with just such an ability. It doesn't help that they are incredibly common among manipulators. Baze, Boki, Lumi, and Shalnark are all examples of this. this. This, paired with their capability to initiate and maintain control of their targets at long distances, thanks to their proximity to a mission, means that they can be incredibly troublesome and nerve-wracking to fight. With that said, however, manipulators are probably the category with the most inherent weaknesses. Firstly, they can be countered by other manipulators, since manipulation works on a first-come, first-served basis. Also, even those manipulators who don't take control of their opponents, such as the one with the ability acquisitioning Hatsu I referenced earlier, can have countermeasures in place to take control of themselves if they're ever threatened by someone else trying to take control of them. Secondly, they're overly tool-reliant. 3 of the 4 manipulators I referenced earlier, namely Boki, Illumi, and Shal, all rely on penetrating their opponents with needles in order to take control of them. Like seriously, I'd carry needles around with me and take them out during a fight, even if I was a simple enhancer or transmuter, just to spook my opponent and make them paranoid. Even those manipulators that can't take control of an opponent are still overly tool-reliant, such as Moral needing his pipe to transmute his aura into smoke, or Kaluto seemingly needing his fan to control the enhanced paper confetti. Thirdly, they're oftentimes overly setup-reliant. To get the most out of their abilities, those like Illumi, Baze, and Shal need to take time to find adequate people to take control of, which is a double-edged sword, since they reveal their abilities to their opponents and lose on the surprise factor. Moral needs to transmute enough smoke, and Miluki needs to stop arguing with people on 4chan, get off his lazy ass, and do something. All equally tough conditions. Finally, I've recently come of the opinion that, as of chapter 400 at least, manipulators are the second most predictable category behind enhancement. Controversial, I know, but you've listened to me blabber on this far, so hear me out. Baze, Boki, Illumi, and Shal control people. Squala and Ponzu control animals. Moral and Kaluto control inanimate things. They're all incredibly consistent in that they utilize the core mechanic of their category in pretty predictable ways, with Moral being by far the most versatile, utilizing every damn category apart from conjuration and of course specialization. To great effect, mind you. Moral best guy. The only outlier is Poof, who's all over the damn place with his abilities to such an extent that I'm genuinely surprised Togashi didn't make him into a specialist. But as always with the Chimera Ants, it's very soliciting and diffusive induction type manipulative abilities, only coercive, i.e. the ones which exert total control over an opponent, and very arguably pseudo-coercive ones, i.e. those which try to trick the opponent or trap them into triggering a manipulator's ability to take control, can be said to be combat viable. And we've known about coercive types like Illumi and Shal since the beginning, so the information isn't really new. In any case, while it is possible that manipulation will be further expanded on in a combat context, until such a moment, I have to consider it as being more easily predictable and therefore counterable than a mission. In conclusion, owing to their inbuilt counterability, over-reliance on using tools and setup, as well as their second lowest ranking in Hatsu versatility and unpredictability, manipulation is, in a general sense, and my humble opinion, the worst combat attunable Nen category. And that's that. Hope you guys enjoyed. So, what you think? How does my list match how you judge things to be? If you'd change anything around, do feel more than free to comment down below. I'm sure there are still more things to consider, but until we get a fresh batch of chapters, or one of you rocks my world with a new argument I hadn't heard before, I must stand by this. As always, thank you very much for watching. Subscribe if you like more content like this. If you like to go the extra mile in supporting the channel, do consider becoming a channel member, and I'll see you in the next one.